My name is Teresa Grimes. This is a story that has been on my mind for 60-some years now. It is about my sisters, Barbara and Petey. Her real name is Patricia Kathleen, but we always called her Petey. She was tall for her age, 12 plus, but very graceful and pretty. Barbara Jean, 15, was very petite and also pretty. We were a poor family. My mother worked hard for us. She said she didn't have to worry about us being kidnapped because we were poor. Little did she know what would happen to our family.
On October 18, 1955, the bodies of three young boys, 14-year-old Robert Peterson, 13-year-old John Schuessler, and 11-year-old Anton Schuessler, were found naked in a ditch. The case changed the community forever. The search for answers was intense, but justice seemed to be an impossible dream as the case went cold for almost 40 years. Who could have committed such a heinous act against innocent young boys? How did they manage to evade justice for so long? Step back in time to the 1950s and discover Chicago's hidden gem, the Northwest Side. Nestled in this district, Norwood Park and Jefferson Park were a haven for people seeking respite from the turbulence of inner-city living. The tight-knit community revolved around its parish, Little League, and bowling alleys. With the lowest crime rate in the city, it was a coveted place to raise a family, until a tragedy shook this community in 1955. On February 11, 1942, in Cook County, Chicago, Malcolm and Dorothy Peterson welcomed their first child, Robert Bobby Peterson. Robert was the eldest of four siblings, with younger sisters Barbara Ann, 7, and Susan, 5, and a little brother named Tommy, who was only 3 years old. Even as a kid, Robert was known for being neat and orderly, with a room that was always in pristine condition. He was a responsible young man who not only helped out at home, but also participated in various community activities. John Schuessler was born to Anton John Schuessler Sr. and Eleanor Lillian Holtz Schuessler on November 30, 1941. From a young age, John had a passion for sports and was an outstanding kid who stayed out of trouble. 2 years later, on November 12, 1943, his brother Anton John Schuessler, or Tony as he was called, was born. From a very young age, he knew he wanted to grow up to be a veterinarian. The two brothers were inseparable and did everything together, from hanging out to having the same circle of friends. As the sun set on the quiet streets where John, Anton, and Robert spent their childhood playing sports and exploring their neighborhood, a foreboding sense of something dark and sinister lingered in the air. Something terrible was about to happen. It was October 16, 1955, and a crisp autumn day in Chicago. The two young brothers, 13-year-old John and 11-year-old Anton, hopped on their bikes and pedaled over to their friend Robert's house. They'd already helped their father hang a clothesline in the basement as he was not feeling well, so they had the day to themselves. John and Anton had each got $1.25 in cash burning a hole in their pockets and a daring plan: to sneak downtown and catch a movie. It was a risky and forbidden adventure for the brothers, but their 14-year-old friend Robert was the expert and was allowed to go.
John and Anton Schuessler and their friend Robert Peterson, they went to the Loop Theater to see a Walt Disney movie called The African Lion. We believe they were picked up and disappeared.
His mother, Dorothy, even helped them pick out a film, Disney's The African Lion, for them to watch in the Loop Theater. With $1.50 in his hand, Robert bid goodbye to his parents, kissed them according to their family routine, and left the house with the promise of returning home by 8 p.m. As the night grew darker and the clock ticked past 8, panic set in for both families. There was no sign of the boys and no phone calls. Eleanor, John and Anton's mother, made a call to the Peterson house to inquire about the boys. Dorothy, Robert's mother, informed Eleanor that they'd left for downtown, which was a shock for her. The fear only grew when there was no word from the boys, prompting Dorothy Peterson to contact police at the Gale Street station at around 10 p.m. She spoke to Sergeant Petz, who asked the families to contact the police again if the boys didn't return in an hour. The sky had been beautiful blue when the boys had set out on their adventure, but as the day wore on, the weather took a turn for the worse. The stormy night brought heavy rainfall and added an extra layer of anxiety to the neighborhood. Despite the harsh conditions, Mr. Peterson and Mr. Schussler refused to give up their search for their missing sons. They scoured every hamburger place along Milwaukee Avenue and even checked the Loop Theater where the boys had planned to see a movie. But all their efforts turned up nothing. The boys seemed to have vanished into thin air, and it became clear that the only option left was to involve the police. Despite their kids attending the same school and being friends, the Peterson and Schussler families had never really crossed paths or spoken to each other. It was as if their lives were running parallel without ever intersecting. Little did they know that their lives were about to become deeply intertwined in a way they never could have imagined. As the police began their search for the missing boys, they asked the parents about the boys' clothing and possessions, hoping to gather any possible clues. They learned that Robert had been wearing a distinctive White Sox jacket, while the other boys were wearing Cubs jackets. But where could they be? The downtown area was hours away by car, so it seemed unlikely that they could have gone that far. Perhaps they'd spent their money on snacks and were walking back home in the heavy rain. Or maybe they'd gone bowling, a favorite activity of the boys. As the sun rose on October 17, 1955, the day after the boys' disappearance, the sense of unease in the community grew even stronger. The police were baffled as well, as they'd never had a case in that community where a missing child didn't turn up. Although Robert had skipped school a few times before, everyone knew he was responsible and would never leave Anton and John on their own. The detectives decided to visit Farnsworth School on Linder Avenue, where the boys studied, to see if the disappearance had something to do with the school. Principal D.W. Thornton suggested searching the north branch of the Chicago River in the Forest Preserve, as it was a spot known for past incidents of violence. A year before the boys disappeared, a grade school pupil was assaulted by a high school boy near the river. The teachers of the boys, Mrs. Bernice Jonas and Miss Cecilia Schwachton, were distraught and tried to keep their composure. Mrs. Jonas speculated that one or two men might have been trying to attract the attention of the students in the last few days, according to some students. The community was filled with terror, and the detectives knew that if they didn't find the boys soon, rumors and speculations would fog the truth. The detectives had their work cut out for them. With 60,000 people in the area, they had a lot of doorbells to ring and a vast area to cover. They knew they had to narrow down the search locations to increase their chances of success. So they began by checking the Loop Theater and contacting the bus drivers who were working on the day the boys went missing. One driver, Bruno Mansorini, had a crucial lead. He remembered seeing the boys who matched the description of Robert, John, and Anton getting on his bus at Berthoud Avenue, showing student ID cards. He dropped them off at Lawrence Avenue, where they were headed to the Jefferson Park recreation alleys for bowling. The problem was they hadn't asked for a transfer slip, which meant they were supposed to get off at Central near the Peterson home. Perhaps that innocent change of plan triggered a horrifying series of events. It seemed like the detectives were finally making some progress in the search for the missing boys. Sightings at the bowling alley provided the next crucial lead. Neighbors and relatives of the boys confirmed they'd seen Robert and Anton at Monte Cristo Bowling Alley, going to take a washroom break while John chatted with a neighbor. The boys left at 8 p.m. after Robert and Anton returned from the washroom. The alley manager, Edward C. Davis, added more information to the mix, revealing that the boys had been there twice that day, once around 3:15 p.m. and again at 7 p.m. They'd not bowled because they didn't have enough money. It raised the question, how did three young boys end up back at the same location where they'd been turned away just hours earlier? Why would they return without any money to bowl? The detectives had a timeline to work with now, and it was up to them to piece together the rest of the puzzle, but there were still gaps in their understanding of what had happened. It was frustrating to know that they were so close to the boys, yet still unable to find them. The atmosphere in the office of Russell Corcoran, the captain of the 33rd Precinct of the Chicago Police Department, was tense and heavy on that fateful day of October 18, 1955. The case of the missing Peterson and Schussler boys had consumed the entire department, and the captain had just finished reassuring the commissioner that they were doing all they could to find them. But then the phone rang again at 1:15 p.m., and the captain answered it, thinking it was just another routine call. But as he listened, his face turned pale and tears welled up in his eyes. After hanging up, the captain made a grim announcement that would haunt the team of detectives forever. 3 naked bodies of young boys had been found.
The following Tuesday, early in the morning, a liquor salesman had parked his car in Robinson's Woods. He gets out of his vehicle and he examines it closer and realizes these are 3 young boys, unclad, lying as if they were carelessly tossed from a vehicle.
That day, Victor Livingston, a liquor salesman in his mid-50s, was cruising around in his car enjoying the fruits of his labor. He'd earned a good amount of money and he wanted to have his lunch in a tranquil place. So he decided to drive to Robinson Woods Forest Preserve, a picturesque area on the northwest side of Chicago, known for birdwatching and fall colors. But little did he know that he was about to stumble upon something horrific. As he sat in his car just about to eat, something caught his eye, a body lying motionless on the ground. He quickly drove away to find a phone and call the police. As the bodies were dumped in a 2-foot-deep ditch, only one was visible. The detectives had been searching high and low for the missing boys, but what they found was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Just 2 weeks before Halloween, the boys were discovered naked and stacked on top of each other, with Robert's head bearing a ghastly wound that had long since dried. To make matters worse, the area had already been contaminated, with no chance of finding footprints or any other useful evidence.
This was never heard of before, at least within the span of recent memory. So the case became what was known in those days as a heater case in police parlance. When they didn't come home that night, that is really began the manhunt.
The news hit everyone like a ton of bricks. The detectives were supposed to remain detached from the cases, but that day, tears flowed freely as they mourned the tragic loss of the innocent children. The detectives were left to piece together what little evidence they could find, including the fact that there were no footprints near the bodies, indicating that the boys had been thrown from a car or truck. The killer had covered their tracks well, leaving no trace of the boys' clothing or any other incriminating evidence at the scene. To add to the mystery, there was a significant amount of grease found on their hands, backs, and soles. This led the detectives to believe that the boys were killed somewhere else before being dumped in the woods. Besides, if they'd been killed there, the rain would have washed the blood away. In a harrowing turn of events, an autopsy conducted on the 3 boys found in the Robinson Woods Forest Preserve revealed that they'd been dead for at least 36 to 40 hours before being discovered. While the initial suspicion was that the boys had been assaulted, the autopsy confirmed that this was not the case. However, Dr. Harry R. Hoffman, an associate of the Cook County Behavior Clinic, grimly noted that the person responsible for such a heinous act was likely gratifying their urges through the act itself. Dr. Jerry Kearns was a seasoned professional when it came to examining human remains. He didn't let the gravity of his work follow him home, but the case of the Schussler-Peterson boys would prove to be unforgettable. Anton Jr. had been struck in the neck like a karate chop, but the evidence of fingernail marks on Anton and John's necks suggested that they were strangled. The Schussler boys appeared to have been strangled with bare hands, while Robert had apparently been strangled with a rope. He'd also been savagely beaten about the head 14 times with a rake or some sort of gardening tool, and the other boys had been hit on their faces with what appeared to be the flat side of a knife. Coroner Walter E. McCarrow also weighed in on the tragedy, calling it the work of a madman and potentially a gang of older boys. It was noted that Robert, John, and Anton were likely held captive in a filthy place, bound and gagged with strips of adhesive tape before being dumped in the forced preserve. Dr. Cairns knew that this was no ordinary crime. This was not done by a boy or boys their own age, he declared, nor was it done by a single man of 18 or 20. The killer had attacked from the left rear, and though it had all the markings of a horrendous crime, there was no evidence of assault. Robert had fought for his life with head injuries to prove it. A witness even claimed that the car was a Packard, leading to the questioning of nearly 1,000 Packard owners. Despite an extensive investigation, which involved questioning over 43,000 people, the killer remained elusive. Anton Schuessler Sr., who had lost his 2 sons, spoke out about the tragedy, saying, "When you get to the point that children can't go to the movies in the afternoon and get home safely, something is wrong with the country." But tragedy wasn't finished with the Schuessler family yet. Anton Sr., only 41 years old, died of a heart attack just a month after the murders. The life of Eleanor Schuessler turned lonelier than ever. She'd lost both her sons and her husband. As time went by, she married Valentine Bud Kujawa and tried to move on with her life, but the memories of the murders never left her. She kept a photograph of the boys and a bronzed baby shoe of each on her dresser as a constant reminder of the children she'd lost. For decades, she lived with the haunting question of what had happened to her boys, and occasional visits from investigators only served as a painful reminder of the unsolved case. Her stepson, Gary Kujawa, remembered how much the murders affected her, saying that she was always reminded of the tragedy. The Peterson family also struggled to cope with their loss. Malcolm, Robert's father, not only lost his son, but also his best friend. Dorothy, Robert's mother, was left so weak by the tragedy that she needed a physician's care. Chicago was a strange place in the months following the murders. Hundreds of officers scoured the streets, desperately trying to find any trace of evidence or even a shred of the boys' clothing. Parents were hesitant to let their children out of their sight, afraid that they too could fall victim to the unknown assailants. The mere thought of leaving their kids at home alone was now out of the question. Doors were locked tightly shut, and even discarding items in the trash seemed like a risky move, as anything suspicious could lead to intense interrogation by the investigating officers. Terror had seeped into every aspect of life, leaving the community paralyzed with fear. Despite the chaos, the investigation pressed on, with the presence of hundreds of uniformed police officers and plainclothes detectives canvassing the neighborhood. Captain Louis Caparelli pulled an additional 200 officers from his detail, all of whom voluntarily surrendered their weekend to assist in the manhunts. It was an unprecedented show of solidarity within the Chicago PD, with one officer remarking, "I never saw anything like it."
Were they let go in the woods, minus their clothes, and the car drove off? Or were they taken somewhere and given to somebody? This is pretty much where the trail ends.
It wasn't until December 7th, 1955, that a set of curious markings found on John's left thigh, midway between his knee and hip, caught the attention of the Chicago Daily News. The markings were oval in shape, measuring 4 inches by 2 inches, with a pattern of stars and letters imprinted on the fatty layer of tissue below the skin. Most notable was the word bear. Dr. Kearns had missed this detail in his preliminary findings. But that wasn't all that had been missed. Funeral home attendants had discovered shocking bone fractures in the Schuessler brothers, which Dr. Kearns had failed to detect. And there was another crucial piece of evidence. Adhesive tape had covered the boys' faces, but it had been removed before the bodies were left in the ditch. The ones who did this crime knew what they were doing, Coroner McCarran concluded. They were careful to remove the tape used to blindfold and gag the victims, since it might have shown fingerprints. The leads that once seemed so promising gradually dwindled away, and the once bustling investigation turned into a silent and stagnant cold case file. The gruesome murders of 3 young boys in Chicago left investigators with more questions than answers.
On Friday, December 28, 1956, they wanted to go to the movies to see Elvis. They were crazy about Elvis Presley. My mother said it was so cold out they shouldn't go. They told her they would be warm and please could they go. My mother relented and said yes.
As if the case wasn't puzzling enough, over a year later, on December 28, 1956, 2 teenage girls, 15-year-old Barbara Grimes and 13-year-old Patricia Grimes, went missing after watching their favorite movie, Love Me Tender.
They left the house about 6:30. The movie theater was down Archer Avenue, and they would take a bus.
So they went to the Brighton Theater. They were singing Elvis Presley's Love Me Tender.
Love me tender, love me sweet, never.
Their bodies were found naked on a roadside, similar to the earlier murders. However, unlike the boys, there was no clear cause of death. The coroner's jury ruled that the sisters froze to death.
Coroner's official cause of death was basically secondary shock due to cold temperatures. The way they were found wasn't a natural position like 2 people that froze to death and just kind of fell asleep.
But the chief investigator, Harry Gloss, disagreed. He believed that the ice around the bodies showed that they were warm when they were left there, and that the puncture wounds in Patricia's chest were signs of violence before death. He also suspected that Barbara had been assaulted, which the pathologists had denied. The eerie similarities between the 2 cases led to speculation that the same person might have been responsible for both. After decades of frustration and dead ends, it seemed like the case of the murdered boys in Chicago would remain a mystery forever. But then, in 1994, a bombshell dropped. And it wasn't the kind of evidence you see in TV crime dramas. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no trace evidence examined by a forensics expert. Instead, it was a seemingly innocent comment made by a snitch in a completely unrelated investigation that suddenly opened up a direct path to a suspect in this long-dormant investigation. During an investigation into suspected horse killings and the mysterious disappearance of candy heiress and horsewoman Helen Voorhees Brock on February 17, 1977, a breakthrough occurred. When Special Agent Jim Grady and his partner, Mr. Rotuno, began piecing together clues from the horse racing industry, they knew they were entering a world of secrets. As the pieces started to fall into place, the prosecution team found themselves delving into an underworld of murderers, arsonists, swindlers, conmen. As they dug deeper, they started hearing whispers about a man named Kenneth Hansen in relation to the boys' slayings, who had bragged about the incident to the people he was close with. For years, the case was built from fragments of information culled from this murky world. But somehow, they managed to make it all fit together, painting a vivid picture of what had happened all those years ago. And by the early 1990s, detectives were closing in on Kenneth Hansen. Born to Ethan and Lucille Hansen in 1933, Kenneth Hansen's life was not devoid of drama. Known for his intelligence and charisma in childhood, he went on to marry his high school sweetheart, Beverly Ray Carlson, and had 2 sons, Danny and Mark. He opened and operated a riding stable with the name Camelot near Tinley Park in the 1960s. Roger Spry, a young worker at Hansen's riding stable, started residing at the Hansen house when he was just 11 or 12 years old, becoming a member of the family. But things took a dark turn when Hansen, after making inappropriate advances towards Spry, banished him to the kennels to sleep with the dogs. One fateful night, when Spry was still a child, Hansen initiated a relationship with him that would last for years until Spry was 18. Over the course of 2 decades, Spry lived on and off with Hansen. All the while, the latter picked up male hitchhikers, aged between 11 and 16 years old, and offered them lodging at the stables in exchange for work. On many occasions, Hansen bragged to Spry about having relations with these young boys. As the summer of 1994 approached, Mr. Hansen began to feel the weight of impending doom as the investigation into his possible involvement in a decades-old case closed in on him. According to the detectives, he was so paranoid that he began asking his neighbor whether there were any police officers lurking around his house. Intrigue and drama continued to unfold in the investigation surrounding the disappearance of Helen Voorhees Brock. In July 1994, police made a solid move by charging Richard Bailey, a former stable owner and acquaintance of Hansen's, with soliciting Brock's murder. But that was not all, as authorities also charged 23 other individuals for their alleged involvement in schemes to kill valuable horses in order to collect insurance payments. On August 11, 1994, the long arm of justice finally caught up with Hansen as he was arrested by the Chicago Police and Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms at his home in Country Club Hills when he was caught with a packed suitcase. The arrest was related to an arson charge for a 1972 fire that destroyed the Forest View Stables, a competing business, and claimed the lives of 36 horses. The next day, on August 12th, he was charged with 3 counts of murder in the Peterson-Schuessler case. He was 22 at the time of the murders and 61 at the time of his arrest. The announcement of charges against Kenneth Hansen for 3 counts of murder left many wondering what evidence the authorities had against him. Refusing to disclose any hard evidence, Cook County State's Attorney Jack O'Malley emphasized that after 40 years, the case could not be solved solely on physical evidence. This statement only added to the mystery surrounding the case, leaving people wondering how the prosecution would build their case against Hansen. While Robert Hansen was among the 43,000 people initially questioned, there's no evidence to suggest that he knew he was a suspect or that he intentionally kept his involvement a secret from investigators. Police believe that on October 16, 1955, Robert, John, and Anton were hitchhiking on Milwaukee Avenue when they were picked up by Hansen. At the time, he lived only a few blocks away from where he found the boys. Hansen then drove them to Idle Hour Stables, a place he worked at and frequented, located on the city's northwest side. According to sources, Hansen tried to solicit inappropriate acts from the boys and became violent when they refused. The situation escalated, and Hansen ended up murdering the boys. On the same night, Hetty Salerno, a witness, was going about her business when she suddenly heard 2 blood-curdling screams pierce the air. The screams seemed to come from the direction of the Idle Hour stable. Spry, who lived with Hansen's family, testified that Hansen once told him of a horrifying incident involving 3 boys whom he'd picked up while they were hitchhiking. As per Hansen's account, he took them to a barn and took Anton inside the barn and assaulted him. He then took John inside when Robert and Anton came barging in with a threat. They said they'd report the incident to their parents and police if he didn't let them go. However, in the ensuing argument, the defendant grabbed one of the boys by the throat and accidentally strangled the boy, and was then forced to kill the other 2 boys to avoid being reported. Following the killings, Hansen's friend arrived, and together they disposed of the bodies in the nearby forest preserves, where an employee helped them. Hansen had bragged about killing the boys to multiple people. In some of the accounts, he mentioned how his brother, Curtis Hansen, attacked one of the boys using a blunt object. Kenneth Hansen lived in fear as he suspected that Curtis could reveal his secrets any time. During the first trial, witnesses testified that Hansen had confessed to them about killing the boys in a tack room at the Idle Hour stable. At that time, the stable was owned by Silas Jane. He was a notorious figure in the world of horse breeding, known for his wild and reckless behavior and suspected involvement in various violent and devious dealings. Despite this, he managed to rise to power in the industry, becoming a prominent figure in the Chicago horse scene. It was suspected that Silas somehow got to know the 3 boys had been killed in his stable and was furious. According to some of the accounts by the witnesses, he even helped dump the bodies. Hansen boasted that after the discovery of the bodies, he shifted to South Chicago and had someone burn down the Idle Hour stable for him to avoid any evidence. In 1995, Hansen was convicted of the heinous crime, but his luck seemed to turn as the Illinois Appellate Court overturned his conviction 5 years later. It was found that the jury should not have been presented with evidence of Hansen's past behavior of picking up boys for inappropriate relations. However, justice eventually caught up with them at a retrial in 2002. The jury wasted no time in reaching a verdict, and Hansen was found guilty once again. The judge was not lenient in his sentencing, and Hansen was given 200 to 300 years in prison, as they made sure he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He appealed the decision in 2004, but it was upheld. Kenneth Hansen battled dementia in the Pontiac Correctional Center and died on September 13, 2007, at the age of 74 due to natural causes. The news of his conviction stirred a mix of emotions, with some feeling a sense of relief, while others were consumed by anger. One individual deeply affected by the revelation was a stepbrother of the Schussler brothers, whose pain and resentment resurfaced upon hearing of Hansen's passing. "The case was as phony as could be," declared Leonard Goodman, former attorney of Mr. Hansen, who was still convinced of his client's innocence. Goodman believed that if Hansen had been arrested soon after the murders, he could have presented a solid alibi. But with 4 decades gone, it was impossible to recollect the whereabouts of a specific day in October 1955. However, the prosecutors and investigators maintained that the evidence against Hansen was substantial and that the case was a deadlock. Furthermore, he claimed that Hansen had preyed on hundreds of boys in the years leading up to his arrest. The Peterson-Schussler murder case was more than just a crime. It was a haunting tale that gripped the entire city, spreading like a wildfire of fear and apprehension. Once a peaceful town where neighbors looked out for each other, it now became a place where people dreaded the dark and feared the unknown. While the case will never truly be closed for those who lost loved ones, the arrest and conviction of Hansen provided a sense of closure and relief for the community that had been haunted by the brutal killings for decades. Do you think Kenneth Hansen was guilty of the crime? Do you think the deaths of Robert, John, and Anton were accidental or intentional? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.